Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. Connor Boyack here along with Brian Hyde for an interesting, thought-provoking conversation that Brian and I were chatting about, and that is, in many cases, a person's political philosophy applies to more areas of their life or bleeds outward and affects more aspects of their life than just their views on politics. Because at the end of the day, what is politics? I always loved the definition that I learned in college that, versus poly versus mono, right? Poly is many and ticks are blood-sucking creatures. So,
yeah, I think that holds true.
Absolutely. So politics is the study of blood-sucking creatures. And, but politics is really the study of social interaction, how people govern themselves, how the affairs of society are managed by, the state, by the government. And so politics is really about people. And because someone has certain views on politics, they have a philosophy, political philosophy, that isn't just some abstract notion of, what is right or wrong or what is interesting or scientific proof or whatever. It's talking about their value systems. It's talking about their belief in how people should deal with one another. And because of that, I find it very fascinating when you look at people who have a very core philosophy. They have a very dedicated, view and perspective on their life as it pertains to people interacting one with another. But then, of course, that applies, I should say, to the family as well, right? And so, Brian, you're a very principled person. You have given a lot of thought over the years to your political views, and you've studied a lot. So how have you seen, how many kids do you have?
I have 6 kids.
So you have a lot of kids. I only have 2, right? So you've done this a lot more than I, and your kids are older as well. So how has your political philosophy then, am I wrong to theorize that a person's political views and how people should interact would trickle down? Have you seen it trickle down in your own family? And if so, let's start talking about some examples.
Yeah, without a doubt, it has. But I say this with the understanding, maybe you're like me, I'm still a work in progress. So as settled as I may seem in some of my views, I still try to maintain the attitude that present me with new truth. And if it's truth, I will incorporate it into my life and make the necessary changes. So anything that I say may be subject to change based on access to more truth. But yeah, I look at my kids and, there was a long time when politics wasn't very important to me. It was just kind of in the background and, well, I'm going to go out and vote and get my sticker and therefore, I'm participating. And, if I was really interested, I might study up on an issue. But about the time my kids arrived, my first 2 daughters particularly, it started to matter because all of a sudden I had this responsibility for these 2 little lives. And I realized, you know what? I need to be doing what I can to use whatever influence I have, even if it's just in my home. I need to create the best, safest, most nurturing environment for them to grow in. And as my understanding increased, particularly with politics, and particularly as I came to understand, liberty and understand the value of where our rights come from and why it's important that freedom be a part of our lives, I have definitely tried to incorporate that into how I raise my kids. And, it's dependent on their understanding, but I've tried to raise my kids to be somewhat skeptical, knowing that there are plenty of people out there who are going to tell them this is the way it is and you should never question it.
Mm-hmm. I think an example that comes to my mind is a controversial subject that has been the topic of many interesting Facebook conversations over the years, and that is spanking, right? Or discipline more generally. And to each their own, right? People have different styles and we're raised in different styles, and obviously there's a disagreement on this. But for me, how my political outlook has affected my parenting style, I think it's wrong to initiate force. I think it's wrong to against an innocent person. I think it's wrong to be disproportionate in your defense against another person. So if someone punches you in the face, it's wrong to shoot them in the head, right? And so these are political views that apply to foreign policy. They apply to self-defense from the guy down the road. But I've seen it early on in my life apply to my parenting style, where I decided from an outset, almost as a pacifist in a way, that, I'm non-interventionist and don't tase me, bro, kind of philosophy, right? And so that is applied to parenting. I am very proud to say, like you, work in progress, not perfect, but I am happy that I have never once spanked my children. And that's hard, right? Because sometimes it feels like they need it, right? When they step out of line or whatever. But it has been a very intentional thing that I feel is consistent with my outlook on how human beings should treat one another, especially so the little human beings that we're training to be big human beings. And how is it that we, and again, I'm not, looking down upon others who, spank. I recognize that this is a point of disagreement, but for me, my view is, how can we teach people about the non-aggression principle? How can we teach people to be kind to others and to use your words and to try and reason with someone, persuade rather than use force, if so often the default in our inter-family situation is some aspect of
Sure,
force?
might makes right. So let me ask you this. Was there spanking in your household when you were being raised?
Sorry, mom and dad, but yes.
Okay. No,
Yeah.
and I said same in mine. And in fact, I'm sure the way you and I were raised, we could probably look at how our parents raised us and see where it had influence on us one way or the other on how we believe today. Spanking was a part of my growing up. As I look to my parents and as I've talked to my mom especially, it was a big part of their growing up. And in my experience, the spanking has progressively grown less and less with each generation. My first couple of kids, I'm sorry to say, got the brunt of my bad parenting. I made more mistakes with them than any others. My last couple of kids, particularly my youngest, very, very rarely have we ever had to resort to any kind of corporal punishment. In fact, like you, I've evolved to where I look for ways to avoid it, and I've been much happier with that. That's one of those things. I wish I'd known that before, but I wonder how much of that trickles down from, well, my parents were spanked, and so it was a part of their parenting, and
Right.
it was part of how I was raised. So initially, it was a part of my parenting. It'll be interesting to see how my kids raise their kids.
That's very true. And I think a lot of this, it requires intentionality. It requires being proactive and making a concerted effort to live in a manner that is consistent with your views. And I think a lot of people don't have views strong enough to guide their actions at that granular level. And so they react and they lash out and they spank or they control or they, do whatever. But admittedly, it is very difficult to always try and act in a way that is consistent with that theoretical, abstract idea of here's my principle, right? And so it is tough. Like here's another divisive topic of parental approach, and that is chores. Whether you compel your children to do chores, you can say that it's this authoritarian mandate and enslaving your children to do things, right? Or it's like, hey, this is a participatory thing. We're a family. Everyone pulls their own weight. You gain benefit here from being part of the family, clearly. And so where there's benefit, there has to be a contribution. You can't just be a consumer. You have to be a producer. And Brian, I'd love your take on this. For me, I don't think chores are wrong at all, but I think chores have to. I think the child has to understand the importance of chores. I think people have to understand, getting back to the political realm, the rationality of why things should be the way they are, why markets should work, why we shouldn't have healthcare mandates, why there should be personal responsibility. We can't just go around forcing people to do the right thing. We can't just change the law and say, oh, sorry, all you socialists, ha, 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 you don't get what you want. We have to create a culture of awareness and desire for the policies that we want. Otherwise, the culture will overrun and change the policies to be what the culture wants. I think it's the same thing with children. We need to change the culture where they recognize that they are a valued member of the family. They have to contribute, and you can create kind of those social stigmas and shaming or whatever and use persuasion. What are your thoughts on chores?
There's been a metamorphosis in how we approach chores too, because it used to be, look, you either do this or you forego these privileges. No television tonight, no, games or whatever it was they wanted. The people who did chores will eat dessert, the others won't. And I look at that now and I think, gee, that was pretty much blackmail.
Yeah.
You're going to do this or else. somehow along the way, most of my kids, not all of them, but most of them, came to the conclusion that there was something to be proud of for helping to keep our household going. And I don't know exactly when it happened, but for instance, my son, my 16-year-old son, has taken it upon himself to make sure that our lawn looks good. And he does a fantastic job. And you know what? I don't have to bribe him with a milkshake like I used to. Hey, if you mow the lawn today, I'll buy you a milkshake. Mm-hmm. I still go and buy him one just sometimes on the spur of the moment. But more than anything, I show him appreciation. I vocally show him appreciation in front of other people and say, have you noticed how great the lawn looks? That's because of David. Mm. That is his handiwork, and it sure looks great. And that has served his self-interest more so than however many milkshakes I've bought him over the years.
So I'm teaching this class right now for teenagers at the homeschool co-op where my children attend. And every week we're discussing a different political philosophy. We're actually walking them through, the scholastics and the classical liberals and the socialists and the libertarians and the anarchists and the communists and everything in between. So it's a lot of fun. And last week we were talking about classical liberals and this post-Enlightenment era outlook on life, and that for the classical liberals, for the listeners who don't understand that term, back in the day, they weren't classical liberals. They were just liberals, which is basically libertarian. They wanted liberalization and libertad, which is freedom. And so the classical liberals, as we call them now, they did very much consistent with what we're talking about. For them, there was no just political view separate and apart from their moral view or their, economic view. Everything was intertwined. There's a reason why in the Declaration they chose the words pursuit of happiness, because for the classical liberals, the end goal of shaping society in the ideal way was not just to be rich, or it was not just to be free and be left alone. It was for human happiness, and that's a really important thing to consider in this kind of intellectual framework that we've been given by the Founding Fathers, that the purpose of politics is not just to be left alone, which many libertarians, I think, subscribe to. Just leave me alone. There's more to it than the negative, right? There's more to our philosophy and our ideas than just don't tase me, bro. There's also the flip side. There's the other side of the coin to individual liberty is always personal responsibility. It's always taking care of yourself and one another. It's the positive things that we're contributing. And we talk very infrequently, I think, as a movement, as freedom-loving people, about that other side. And I think it's the same thing with parenting. It's so easy to focus on the negative. It's so easy to focus on what's going wrong, and the to-do list and everything else. But are we taking time to focus on kind of that pursuit of happiness and recognizing the things that are working and the things we're doing right?
One of the things that I have found great benefit from, and I see this in you as well, is the liberal arts education, that well-rounded education that's steeped in the classics, but more than anything, it's that well-rounded approach that isn't so much about just packing your head with all these factoids of knowledge, but it's about shaping your character and shaping my character. That isn't something that I had benefit of growing up, in the sense that my parents didn't really understand it. They kind of went by the standard script. Well, you go to school, you study hard, go to college, get a good job, and you stay with that job till it's time for retirement, because that's the model that they grew up with. But somewhere along the way, I was turned on to the idea that no, if you pursue, and this goes back to our autodidact conversation from a few weeks back, if you pursue that classical liberal arts type education, or just that well-rounded character building education, that unlocks the key to you realizing potential that is uniquely yours. And that's something that has been much more a part of my children's education than it was mine when I was young. What about you? What was your experience?
Yeah, and it's very similar, right? It was very institutional. It was very, this is the way things are done. And I think as I think about my parents' political views early on, it was very much, not establishment isn't the right word, but it was very status quo oriented. It was very safe within, as Tom Woods likes to call the 3x5 card of
the mainstream,
allowable opinion. And so, I grew up in that type of environment where there were, almost boundaries in a way. And this is just, the way things are done. And it's been really interesting in my family where I've adopted these controversial ideas or out of the mainstream ideas. And at first it was like, oh, Connor, you're crazy. And, I remember particularly one day, and I don't think my dad listens to the podcast, so I think it'll be okay to share this story. But I remember coming home one time, and I had gotten my concealed firearm permit. And I think I was in college, and, I was visiting California with a K, right? So I didn't have my firearm on at the time because of their laws there. But I was talking about this, and my dad, who was our scoutmaster, he had taken me on all the, gun shooting trips. He owned many guns, but for him, the guns were, in the safe to take out once in a while. It was not a daily, on your person thing. And so he was critical of me at the time and saying, oh, I don't, see the need for that. And that's silly. Well, now he not only has part of the reason why he perhaps moved and fled California was actually because of gun laws that they were tightening there. But now not only does he have a permit himself, he's a permit instructor. Right? And so throughout my life, I've seen that I've adopted these views, and then family members have come with me. And it's taught me a lot of patience and I don't know what the word is, but having a thick skin where, doing what I perceive to be the right thing and making decisions I think that are consistent with my views. I've taken a lot of flack over the years, as you have as well, especially, the people could call you up and give you their flack directly when you're on the radio, right? Our listeners, fortunately, they have a little buffer right now. So if they are cranky, they can just email us later on. But, you develop a thick skin about these ideas because you're kind of out of the mainstream. But I've seen that over time, people change slowly. And I think applying it to parenting, my thought with that is that having patience with your children, right? Because especially if they're around other peers and they're adopting views and ideas and interests that their peers are, and you're like, oh, I don't, really like that. Just having patience for them to kind of see the wisdom of your path, showing by example rather than trying to force it down their throats and, this is the right thing, so you must do it. Kind of the long suffering and persuasion approach. I wanted to bring up another idea before we wrap this one up as I've thought about applying your political philosophy to your parenting, and that is controlling another person. One of the biggest problems I think we have in politics, especially at the local level, is everyone's desire to control their neighbors, right? Like, hey, it's okay if I have freedom. I can rent out my home, but no one else in my neighborhood should be able to, because I can't trust them.
I can handle it.
Exactly.
Unlike them.
I can assume the burden of freedom, but we can't trust everybody else. And so you find that bubbles up, right? This idea to control everyone else, to create a comfortable, safe, sterile society that a person feels, that they're not going to be harmed or whatever. And that is a big political plague of our day, is this innate, inherent desire to control the other people. Now, those who share our ideas, I think, try to divest themselves of any of those tendencies, try to shed the desire to control other people. Instead, as some smart guy once said, teach themselves correct principles, let them govern themselves and be willing to let them make mistakes. Even if a neighbor has a big party that goes till 2 a.m., it's like Jefferson said, I'm going to butcher it, but I would rather be subject to the problems that attend from too much liberty than too little. And so I think those with our ideas are willing to be a little bit lenient, even with, a little bit of negative consequences that comes from having more freedom. And so I think the same thing with parenting, right? That if we want our children to do things that we want them to do in the way that we want them, because we want it done on our time and schedule and in a way that won't burden us, I've seen many parents get very controlling, very regimented and structured, very demanding. This is the way it will be done. And, I'll be very blunt. I like most people have that same tendency. I want it to be convenient. Sorry, I'm in the middle of something. You'll have to do that later or whatever. But I think that if we subscribe to a philosophy that should allow other people to do the things that they want in a way that they want to, we have to treat our children that way, because how can we get them used to that idea or understanding that idea if we don't let them practice and experience it throughout their entire childhood?
The hardest time to put that into practice for me is when there is open defiance going on the part of a child. When there's a mutiny underway, that's when that's when the dictator in me wants to come out and clamp down and remind them there's a pecking order here, and the accountability comes to me. So I'm going to set this right. It's hard to let them make the mistakes. Sometimes you just have to sit back and let it happen. We had this experience just a few days ago. My youngest son decided he wanted to help with trimming the yard with the weed eater, and I was like, "No, are you sure you know how to do this?" And the controlling part of me was like, oh, you better save that for somebody who knows what they're doing. But I told him, it's okay. If you make a mistake, it'll grow back. Just, be careful. And off he went to, start weed eating the yard. Well, about 5 minutes later, I get called into the house. We have a little bit of a problem. He put the weed eater to his ankle.
Ooh.
And man, I'll tell you, he lost.
Ouch.
So, there was a negative consequence. He wasn't in trouble for it. But, I felt bad for him that he had to learn a painful lesson. At the same time, I was also glad that I gave him the chance to get out there and try it and learn. This isn't as easy as you think it is.
Yeah.
I gave him the basic instructions, but now in retrospect, I'm like, okay, maybe I should have given him direct supervision instead of keeping on doing what I was doing.
There's such an important analogy here to natural law versus positive law. And for the listeners who don't understand the difference, natural law is, pre-existing, observable, like the law of gravity. Basically, you can't pass a bill in Congress to stop gravity, right? That is a fundamental law. Versus positive laws, which are man-made laws. They only exist because the government got together and said, hey, this is going to be illegal now. You can't, collect turtles between these months on this beach. And so natural, of course, is natural, organic, spontaneous, pre-existing. And positive is the opposite of all. It's arbitrary, right? And I think the same thing with what happened to your son, where having a natural consequence is the most effective teaching manner that I've ever seen in my brief experience as a parent, but also as a child, right? Versus arbitrary consequences. It's so hard for a child, I think, to absorb the lesson when the consequences are arbitrary, like loss of, permission and privileges or grounding or whatever. You don't learn the lessons as well because the focus is on the arbitrary nature of, oh, that's unfair, and that rather than, oh, dang, that, my ankle got tore up, right? Because I did that wrong.
Frankly, all of us learned a lesson. So he learned one for sure, but my other kids learned that, hey, there are precautions you have to take. I learned that you can't be distracted when your kid says he wants to help out, and you ought to dang well make sure he's wearing long pants and not shorts.
I'm sure your wife reminded of you that, right?
She may have mentioned that, yeah.
There's natural laws for us, too, as spouses. So, okay, this is kind of an interesting topic, right? Because just like the classical liberals of yesteryear, but also us today who adopt and try to adhere to these very important principles, they shouldn't be put in a box. This isn't for our political bucket. I've seen great success and satisfaction personally, and Brian, I think you have as well, of trying to be consistent with our beliefs across the board and not just, oh, this is how I vote or this is what I think the government should do. It's, no, this is how I think the affairs of society should be managed, and our family is part of society. Why would we have one set of rules for myself and, my family versus, hey, the rest of you need to follow these rules for how you interact with one another? And so finding a way to be consistent with that in our family and our parenting style, I think, is super important.
I would agree. And I will admit it's a struggle. There's times when it's very easy to put into practice, but there's a lot of times I struggle too. When I see somebody do something really boneheaded in traffic, I have to resist the urge to think, man, somebody ought to report them. And then I stop and think, all right, is it really worth getting the state involved? I've had my boneheaded moments too. So that's when the whole golden rule comes into play.
Absolutely. Well, we'll leave it there. Today's show notes page is societyandthestate.com/33. Thanks for joining us. Next time, we're going to be talking to Matt Kibbe, formerly of Freedom Works, now of Free the People. Very insightful guy. We're going to be talking about how we market our message specifically to millennials, but a much broader audience to educate the masses. So join us next time, and we'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.